It began with a handshake, not the kind that businessmen casually exchange across a polished table, but the kind that makes the world tremble. Somewhere behind closed doors in the heart of Africa, a single signature slid across paper. Ink dried on the page as the air thickened with the weight of history. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. At first, there was silence, the kind of silence before a storm, a silence that carries secrets too heavy to be spoken aloud. And then, whispers. In trading rooms, war rooms, newsrooms, a single word floated through the air like a spark looking for fire. Traoré. Who was he, really? What leverage had he commanded? And why did a deal worth $1 trillion suddenly make the West's most powerful nations look afraid? This is not just about money, not just about power. It's about the rewriting of a story the world thought it already knew. So lean closer, because once you hear the whole story, you'll never look at Africa or the West the same way. The night was calm, yet uneasy. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the streets hummed with the muted echoes of evening markets closing down. Children played in the dust, shopkeepers packed their wares under fading lanterns, and above them all, the sky stretched wide and endless, a dark canopy dotted with tired stars. To the ordinary passerby, it was just another night. But deep, inside the city, in a heavily guarded compound, history was quietly being rewritten. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a man whose rise had already stunned Africa, was no stranger to calculated risk. Only months ago, he had shocked the world by seizing power, promising sovereignty and dignity for a nation long overlooked and exploited. Many dismissed him as another passing figure in the long and turbulent politics of the region, but those who underestimated him would soon regret it. For Traoré was not playing for months. He was playing for centuries. The room was small but charged with energy. A long wooden table stood at the center, papers stacked neatly, guarded by men whose eyes told stories of war and loyalty. Maps of Africa stretched across the walls, countries marked with pen strokes and scrawled notes in ink. Notes that spoke of trade corridors, mineral routes, and economic choke points. The air smelled faintly of smoke, ink, and destiny. The men seated around the table leaned in as Traoré spoke, his voice low but steady. On the surface, it was a discussion about infrastructure, mining rights, and development. But underneath the wrapping of technical words lay a deeper message. This was about reclaiming the narrative, about refusing to remain the world's resource, well while staying poor at home. The document before him was unlike anything the African continent had ever seen. $1 trillion, a figure so massive that it sounded almost fictional, like a line pulled from a novel rather than real politics. But it was real, and its numbers translated not just to contracts but to futures, to roads carved across deserts, railways binding nations, satellites launched from African soil, and power grids pulsing with independence rather than dependence. Why? Was the West trembling? Because they knew what such a deal meant. For decades, the balance had always been tipped in their favor. Africa exported its gold, oil, cobalt, diamonds, and rare earth metals, while the profits flowed outward. Power was maintained not just through wealth, but through the psychology of underdevelopment, the story that Africa would always remain dependent. But now a man, barely into his 40s, had sat down and written a different script. The whispering halls of Europe caught wind first. Finance ministers watched as reports leaked across their desks. American intelligence floated memos with a single word at the top: urgent. And in the power towns of Paris, London, and Washington, murmurs turned into unease. The question wasn't just how did he do it. The real question chilling the corridors of power was what comes next. If one leader could break the chain and summon a trillion-dollar partnership, what would stop others from following? What would stop the long shadow of colonial-era dominance from cracking, piece by piece, under the weight of Africa's new alliances? For now, though, the meeting in Ouagadougou remained hidden from the public eye. Pen-scratched paper, signatures, flowed, and seals pressed against the page with finality. Somewhere outside, a dog barked, unaware that only meters away a continent was turning a page of its story. That night, as the ink dried, a storm began to gather, invisible but inevitable. And by the time the world awoke to the headlines, the silence of the African night would have already thundered into history. The morning after, newspapers carried cautious headlines. A few obscure outlets in Africa hinted at a historic contract, choosing words carefully as if unsure whether the world was ready to hear the price tag. But in the underground trading channels of London and New York, nobody could stay quiet. Numbers had begun to leak, and once numbers were free, they spread like fire on dry grass. $1 trillion. That sum, dangling in the open, was too explosive to ignore. Inside the glass towers of Wall Street, brokers adjusted their ties and stared at screens that flickered with uncertainty. Oil futures wobbled, rare earth stocks spiked, the algorithms running global markets, emotionless and precise, began to behave as if gripped by panic. Somewhere between digits and decimals, the unspoken truth was dawning. Africa was no longer standing at the table as a beggar. It was sitting as an equal, maybe even as a king. But things weren't quiet in the West's political machine rooms either. In Paris, a midnight meeting convened inside the Élysée Palace. Advisors spoke rapidly over maps of West Africa, voices rising with anxiety. If Traoré cements this deal, France loses not one colony, but the entire leverage of influence across the Sahel, one whispered. Another retorted, not just France. NATO loses its foothold in the very corridor China and Russia crave. The debate spilled over wine glasses, but no one was drinking. Wine couldn't soothe centuries of dependence collapsing in a single night. In Washington, the Pentagon's lights burned late. Generals traced flight paths, diplomats murmured about sanctions, and analysts called out the unavoidable. Stop the bleeding before it spreads. They compared it to a contagion. A single trillion-dollar handshake could inspire dozens of African leaders to follow. Already in Mali, whispers spread in corridors of power. If Burkina Faso could do it, why not them? In Niger, young officers began to talk in secret about sovereignty, and in Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, think tanks buzzed with the possibility of rewriting centuries of uneven contracts. Meanwhile, on the ground in Africa, life felt electric. In Ouagadougou's markets, men and women spoke in low tones about what they had heard. Trillion. Is it true? One asked, shaking his head as if the word itself was absurd. A trillion was something they heard in movies about America or whispered in tales about empires. Now it belonged to their soil. Children laughed louder that week. Farmers tilled their land with a lighter step. No money had yet trickled down, no roads had sprouted, no factories had opened, but hope had arrived, and in places long starved of it, hope itself is power. But hope has enemies. And while people dreamed, shadows moved. Intelligence intercepts caught coded messages between European capitals. Anonymous bankers froze small accounts linked to Burkina Faso's government. Oil shipments suddenly delayed. Mining equipment orders lost in transit. Old strategies dressed up in new excuses. A familiar language of pressure. Yet, Traoré was not unprepared. The deal wasn't inked with a single partner, but spread across a constellation of allies. Some from East Asia, some from the Middle East, and a quiet but undeniable nod from Moscow. Each signature was stitched like armor, designed so that no single foreign power could break the fabric without being burned. The Western press finally exploded. Headlines grew bolder by the hour. West on edge, Traoré's trillion-dollar gambit. Africa rewrites destiny. Global markets brace for realignment. Anchors spoke with polished calm, but you could hear the strain in their voices. The story had broken through containment, and now the world was watching. The airports in Ouagadougou are filled with journalists. Hotel lobbies buzzed with foreign. Correspondents elbowing each other for rumors of who had signed what. Grainy photos emerged of convoys leaving the presidential compound at midnight. Question marks everywhere, and only one figure carrying an answer. Captain Traoré himself, silent, unshaken, moving through crowds with the calm of a soldier who had already seen fire. Yet beneath his calm, the stakes surged higher. Reports whispered of unnamed threats, strange phone calls at night, aircraft circling near borders, saboteurs eyeing fragile infrastructure. He knew the West wouldn't accept defeat with folded hands. Moves and countermoves had already begun, and, while they plotted, Africa was waking up. From Lagos to Nairobi, from Accra to Johannesburg, the word trillion pulsed like a drumbeat. It was no longer just about Burkina Faso, it was about possibility. If one leader could claim that future, who was to say others could not? The air felt charged, like footsteps quickening toward a storm no one could avoid. And in that tension, whispers of panic in Western corridors began to mingle with whispers of liberation in African streets. The world had entered a waiting game. For somewhere unseen, a climax was approaching. The morning after the announcement, the air felt different, not just in Burkina Faso, but across the entire continent. In Accra, students debated loudly in cafes, their fingers tapping on phones, eyes burning with a new light. In Lagos, taxi, drivers turned down their radios mid-traffic to discuss the news with strangers in the next seat. In Johannesburg, tired factory workers paused, leaning against steel beams, whispering, "Did you hear? $1 trillion. For us." It was as if a spell had been broken. For centuries, Africa had been spoken about in whispers of pity and power. But now African voices carried their own narrative. For the first time in living memory, people felt history moving under their feet, not above their heads. But the West was not quiet. News channels spun calmly, framing the deal as risky, destabilizing, even dangerous. Pundits frowned into cameras, warning that Burkina Faso was playing too big. Yet behind the polished words, the fear was visible. For if Africa had dared to break chains once, nothing would stop it from doing so again. Traoré himself moved, through it all almost like a ghost, calm, deliberate, refusing to feed the frenzy. His silence unsettled some, but inspired others. "The man is focused," people said. "He is not chasing headlines, he is building foundations, and foundations once laid are difficult to break." By the end of that week, analysts admitted what they had first denied. This was unstoppable. The signatures, the money, the vision, and it was already alive. All the pressure in the world could not erase the fact that Africa had planted a flag in its own soil and declared it sovereign. In villages and cities, on buses and smartphones, people kept asking one question: what comes next? Would other leaders summon the same courage? Would Africa truly join hands across borders long divided? Would countries that dared dream pay a heavy price for it? Nobody knew. Not yet. But one thing was certain: the world had changed. The old script, the one where Africa listened and others dictated, had been torn up in the middle of the night, replaced by a story still unfinished. The narrator's voice would lean toward you here, softer, darker, as if sharing a secret, meant only for you. It began with a handshake, a single decision, $1 trillion flame sparking in the heart of Africa. And the West? The West is scrambling, panicking, plotting, but too late, because the story has already turned, and that was only the beginning. Then a pause, a beat of silence. If you want to know what happened after the panic, you'll know where to find me.